Good morning.
Did you get the angle right? Is that what you're looking at?
Yeah, that's good. You covered some down here. Okay, we're good. Good stuff. You know. So I have in front of you Saint Benedict and the Rule, and there's a little very summarized version of who Saint Benedict was. But you know, for many of us, referring to anybody as saint still feels a little strange, especially if you come from a more Protestant background. What makes him so saintly? Of course, you know, all believers are saints, but we call him Saint Benedict because of his particular contributions. He's worthy to be memorialized, not because he has some extra special blessings that he carries over to the afterlife that help us get to salvation. But the saints are exemplars, and so here, this particular saint is very important to the understanding of Western Christianity. Without Saint Benedict, our church would look a lot like the East in many ways. But Saint Benedict, I have a little biographical summary that does not do his legacy justice. But here, Saint Benedict of Nursia, 480 to 547. Some of you might recognize that time period. Anything significant happening in that period, 5th century? Think of the great power that was Rome is crumbling. In fact, this period of history is most notable because all of the structure that the Roman Empire once provided has collapsed. And so Benedict, I think, is most relevant to us today because, in many ways, our first world countries behave a lot like the Roman Empire did in those 500 years between Christ and Benedict, and that we were lavish with our expansion, our debts, our lasciviousness, all of those things, and then eventually you run out of money is it Reagan who says the problem with socialism is eventually you run out of other people's money?
Yeah.
But it's the problem really with all the empires that they grow and they grow and they grow, and if there is nothing internally that prevents them from imploding, they eventually do crumble. Morally, financially, jurisdictionally, governmentally. And Benedict comes into Western history at the time when the comforts, the structure, the legal codes, the judicial system, the protection from the outside barbarians disappears. So you can imagine this is Benedict living at the collapse of the world. We might describe this as Benedict at the end of the world. So imagine today if suddenly all of the banks went under, more than just, what's his name, the Sam Freed, that guy, the tiny banking guy. If all the banks went under, if America could no longer protect its borders, if there were no longer any police in the streets, what would we look for? And so Benedict lived in such a time as this. But your description there says he was a Christian monk. Now, monasticism looked a little bit different before Benedict and after Benedict. We have, of course, the Desert Fathers, and we have men who are individuals who go out into the desert, and you have various monastic communities that exist under other rules, but they were largely outside of the city. Well, what happens when there's no more city? How do you build a monastery outside of a city if there's no city? Benedict is going to solve this kind of problem. But Benedict was a Christian monk who founded the Benedictine monastery, monastic tradition, and wrote the Rule, and that's our big phrase for today, the Rule, or la regla. The Rule here references like a measuring stick. Right? So the Rule, a guide for monastic life centered on prayer, work. Prayer and work, you might recognize the Latin phrase ora et labora, pray and work, ora et labora. And communal discipline, communal meaning living in a community, different than just living in the same neighborhood. So communal living was single community around a singular purpose, shared economy, so they had one business amongst them, or shared housing amongst them. Very different than just we all live on Maple Street and we're a communal society. And also very different than maybe modern communist communalism, right? So a different idea here. We're going to go into that. But lived during the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, Benedict provides stability, and that's another key word for Benedict, stability in a time of political and social turmoil. His rule emphasized obedience, humility, and structured daily schedule, offering a model for self-sufficient communities that preserve learning, order, and Christian faith. Benedictine monasteries became centers of education, agriculture, hospitality, playing a crucial role in rebuilding European civilization in the medieval era. Also noted, many of the monasteries are known for preserving alcohol. Some of the best wines and beers come from the monasteries. Sometimes you'll hear about Trappist ale. It's another monastic tradition because they would have to support themselves. So selling beer would be one way. They also had to obey certain fasts of the year. So if you could only consume calories that were not from animals during large periods of the year, beer is a great substitute for beef. Right? So some of the greatest beers come from the monastic communities. But to understand his rule, which is kind of like a manual of how his monastery or how his communities were led, it became instructive to other Benedictine communities that wanted to follow similar rules. Here's from chapter 48 on daily schedule of prayer and work. And I chose this one just because if you have to remember one motto of Benedict, it is ora et labora. So he says, idleness is the enemy of the soul. I think we have a similar saying in our culture. Idle hands are the devil's playthings. Right? Idleness is the enemy of the soul. Therefore, the brethren, that is, people who were in a monastery, were not all priests. Sometimes they were laymen. And if you were dedicated to monastic life, you'd be called a frate or a brother. Right? So a fraternity is a brotherhood. So you address the people who were in the brotherhood as brethren. Therefore, the brethren should be occupied at certain times in manual labor, and in other times in sacred reading. And so, again, inside of his rule, he outlines how it is we organize our time, our life, our hours, our days, our weeks, our months around the common goal of the monastery. Now, what is, of course, the rule of life? And we could spend a lot of time talking about the rules of Benedict in particular, but I wanted to make this a little more personal or applicable to you today and talk about developing a personal rule of life. So to understand this, you have to understand that the rule of life in the monastery was a vow. So in the monastic communities, you would understand you would take certain vows to that community. The first and the most important vow was the vow of obedience to the father of the monastery. You probably heard the word abbot before, an abbot of the monastery, the head of the monastery. In the English church, in the Celtic tradition, abbot was the same thing as a bishop in most of the communities. There was no Roman diocesan model. The entire Celtic Christianity model was built around monastic orders. The abbot was the chief of the community, and all of the civilization was built around the monastic abbot, kind of like the bishops would function on the continent. But when you joined in a monastery, you took a vow of obedience to the abbot and to the rule that that particular house, that community, had established. Sometimes the vow would be towards chastity, that is, you're single forever. Sometimes the vow would be towards poverty, of not collecting personal wealth. There'd be different types of vows, but you'd also have different vows towards discipline and structure. You'd obey the calendar that that community has embraced, whether that's a calendar of celebrating different fasting periods, or of certain feasts, or of getting up at a certain time and joining in the chapel at prayer at certain times. You kind of vowed to be in line with the routines of that. So I think we're all generally familiar with. That's what monks do. Right? They get up in the morning before the sun rises, they say their prayers, they do it a couple times a day, and in between the prayer times, they got work, they have prayer, they copy scripture, they teach, they spend time in solitude. They have different practices or habits that were part of their monastic identity. Now, this was very important in the rebuilding of Western culture because the monastic identity preserves pretty much all the books that we have today. So it's the scriptorium, or the copy rooms of the monks, where the monks were required, every day you're going to spend this much time reading the book, and this much time making a physical copy of the book as part of your rule that preserved copies of the scripture, preserved commentaries of the early fathers, preserved commentaries on the, not just the patristics, but the pre-Christian writers, so Plato, Socrates, Pythagoras, all of these things are copied line by line, word by word, in the monasteries as part of their rule, because you have to pray, work, you have to study, you have to do these things together. So if you have a culture that has no stability, because there's no more government, there's no more run school, there's no more judicial system, these little communities became outposts as schools, as centers of learning, and people around them could have their children raised in learning according to the monks. So monks could teach your kids how to read, or teach adults how to do different things, train them. So particularly in Lindisfarne, so I'm thinking of Celtic monasteries more than Benedictine, but Lindisfarne, they became primary ways of evangelism. You have a monastery surrounded by a bunch of pagans, druids and whatnot, and the children wanted to learn to read, study Latin so they can be competent to go across into the continent. Well, they would learn from the monks, and they become educated leaders through the monks. So, but it was all built around the monastic identity of a rule. So, what is a rule of life? Here on your paper it says a rule of life is a commitment to live your life in a particular way. In church history, the particular way was about communal living, so monastic identity. Members of religious communities lived by the rule, and the word rule is used in the same sense that a piece of wood is called a ruler, a guide to help you measure. So the rule of life originated as practices of Christian communities that help them measure and guide their growth into godliness. So that's an important rule here too. None of the monastics thought that they were being saved through this. I mean, it wasn't a matter of salvation. I'm going to make this vow so they can get to heaven. It was a way of measuring spiritual growth. And they were meant to be an example for the laity. So, measure and guide their growth into godliness. Think about the monks going to times of prayer at different hours of the day, or keeping the feast days, which are themes of daily and weekly worship around the saints' church. Those were part of their communal rule of life. And so if the traditional ancient term rule comes across to you as legalistic, you can think of rule as more of a rhythm of life. My friend Dallas Willard calls it a curriculum of Christ-likeness. That's very evangelical friendly, right? Curriculum of Christ-likeness. Like, evangelicals have no problem with doing curriculum or studies or book studies, but as soon as you say, let's be like monks, then that's too Roman Catholics. We'll just rename it Curriculum of Christ-likeness, published by Ligonier, and it'll be acceptable. No, or as a game plan for morphines, as John Ortberg's from Menlo Church, he calls it game plan for morphine. Now, even though we're not going to be Benedictines, although you could be, there's something called third orders, where our lay people take for temporary or long-term vows to become Benedictine. There are ways that you can apply these monastic ideas into your own spiritual life. Sometimes the Christian life gets stunted because we are taught a version of salvation that says, I got saved, now I go to church and everything's the same. Everything I needed I got from that prayer on my knees at the altar call. But we all recognize that there's a goal beyond that of growth. So how do you measure your growth in spiritual life? And how do you chart it out? Do you depend on having good sermons? Do you depend on having access to the sacraments? Do you depend on reading the right books from the Christian bookstore? How do you measure whether or not you are actually spiritually growing? And whose responsibility is it? Is it your pastors? Is it the churches? Is it the small group you belong to? Is it belonging to BSF? Well, the monastic responsibility says everybody is the shepherd of their soul, and the purpose of the rule is to help us measure if the soul is growing closer to God or further away. Now, so one of the ways to do this is with a personal rule of life. Since many of us do not belong to monastic communities, we don't have a written rule to follow. And we can craft a rule, though, to become intentional about this. So, second bold part from the bottom of your handout says, what is helpful is that it is also holistic. What is helpful is that it is also holistic. I wrote that kind of strange, I'm sorry. But that a rule of life hopes to address every part of what makes you human. So some of us can say, I'm feeling really like I'm languishing spiritually. What I really need to do is to open up Knowing God by J.I. Packer and get my soul enlarged. Right? That's not really a holistic way of spiritual growth, because it can improve your biblical knowledge or things like that. But it's not really addressing habits and behaviors and relationships. A rule of life wants to look at, how am I doing in my marriage? How am I doing in my work? How am I doing in my personal relationship with God? How am I doing in what I eat and exercise? So it's more of a holistic view of what I do with my body affects the people around me. So in the monastic tradition, every monk had to follow the same rule, because if somebody didn't do their job, taking out the trash or washing the dishes or showing up to prayer on time, it threw a wrench in the whole cycle. As moderns who are individualistic, we don't have a holistic view of salvation. We think salvation is just about me and getting to heaven. We forget that other people in our community are depending on your spiritual growth so that God can use you to save them. Is that a strange thing to say?
No, that's
Right.
perfect.
But, so if that's true, and you're supposed to shepherd the spiritual life so that you might be ready and equipped and prepared to give an answer to the faith that you've been given, the rule is about how do my daily, weekly, yearly, decade-wise, what is the purpose of my life? And how do I shepherd the hours I'm given to match where I think God is leading me? So what goes into then a personal rule? Okay, so in the end, a personal rule is going to be a list, and I have some example lists for you. They're not expected to have them here, I haven't handed to you yet, because I didn't want you to cheat and look ahead. But a personal rule is going to look like a set of spiritual practices. So it can be disciplines. It's going to not just be spiritual practices, but if you turn to the back side, it can be prayer, fasting, worship, silence, giving, serving, study, confession, many more. But your rule is not just church things. Spiritual practices, of course, are done by every person, and every person is going to decide, what goes into my spiritual rule. Lectio Divina is the great practice, but some people just feel a bit strange doing it, so it's not required for every person. But what you choose is based on your desired growth in love for God and personal holiness. So in order to grow closer towards God, you need to recognize what parts of you are far away from Him. Right? Does that make sense? In order to improve something, you need to measure where it's broken. And you go through the jet, you look for the error codes, right? You look for the repair notes. Right? You don't start at the tank's full, let's get some more gas in here. No, you don't need to do that. You start. You have to start with self-awareness. So, of course, we do confession every week in the service, but there are things that are not sins but are unhealthy, right? Habits that are not great, we can improve on. So, before beginning to draft out what my rule of life might look like, you have to first think about your life, your current situation, your responsibilities, your relationships, your work schedule, your commitments, your life circumstances. So I put here the list of our favorite deadly sins, right? So sloth, envy, greed, pride, anger, lust, gluttony. And their opposites, the virtues of life, right? Fruitfulness, love, generosity, humility, gentleness, chastity, self-denial, moderation. And I put them in this way because the church has traditionally taught that they function against each other. So if you're struggling with lust, it makes sense to focus on chastity, right? But also, if you're struggling with gluttony, you just can't seem to fill your gullet. Every time you drive by the Taco Bell, it seems, Reverend Cease, come through the drive-thru, get a chalupa. Then what's the solution to that? Fasting, self-denial, moderation. So these things are kind of connected, right? But as we look at, I'm going to hand you a handout that says an example of personal life. I want you to think about what you could do, will do, in a rule as you move through time. So a rule for life is not a set of mental resolutions. It's a set of guides for how I'm going to manage my future. How will I address my weaknesses in the time given to me? Not one day, but today, tomorrow, next week. So here are some examples based on time-based ones. So in daily rule, the monks did daily prayer, daily scripture reading, daily memorization, daily solitude. The monks had little cells that they were assigned to stay in for hours at a time, sometimes days at a time. Some monks would have themselves anchored into a church or to a monastery so that they would never be seen again, so they would withdraw. The monks would be required to take notes on what they read. one of the traditions of the Benedictines is be given a book, and you read that same book over and over and over and over for a year, and at the end of the year you have to tell what the book's about, and then you pass that book on to someone else, because you get a copy of it this year. So journaling is an important part of that. Weekly rhythms would include Sabbath keeping, that's coming to the Lord's service, not participating in unnecessary commerce, right? Moving your household and work tasks to Monday through Saturday, so you're keeping your Sabbath holy. Weekly going to small groups, weekly fasting, weekly going to Bible studies, weekly meeting with mentors, things like that. Monthly examples might be in developing what your tithe is going to be, or monthly going to serve, or monthly separating the day out for silence or solitude or withdrawal. Sometimes we use the popular word retreat. And then annually, you might have on your rule, every year I'm going to go on a spiritual retreat. So you can go to a national monastery, there's lots in this area, but a spiritual retreat might be a conference, or it might be engaging with the seasons. I'm going to go celebrate Christmas, somewhere else. That could be something like that. Or there are parts of your rule that could be once in a lifetime things. So like in the Middle Ages, it was very common to make a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, right, to have this spiritual experience, or do the road in Spain called the road of pain, Dolores, where you have to do it on your knees, walking down some stairs. But different pilgrimages, or yeah, something I don't remember what it was. But and then or extended sabbaticals. You work all of these years, but it's pretty normal to take a few months off and have a sabbatical, but you have to plan those things in your rule. So I'm going to hand you an example of a personal rule. We'll go through each rules, and Mrs. Cecil will give you 2 minutes. So we got 2 minutes to go through a personal rule. Now this is an example. An example rule, not something that I want you to copy and say your rule, but if you were in the Benedictine monastery, the rule would begin with, as soon as the bell rings, you're ready for your first hour of prayer. You get your surplice on, or you get your habit on, and you come down to the chapel, and you're chanting the first hour of prayer with all of the other monks before you eat for the day, before you begin your day. That would be the rule to begin that type of prayer. Now, as Anglicans, the prayer book has that kind of rule built into it as well. The little scripture you see at the beginning of the prayer book where it says morning and evening prayer, Cranmer is basing that rhythm off of the monastic rule of morning and evening prayer. So he's simplified it so that the laity can do it, because it'd be difficult if every few hours your entire day was interrupted by a 30-minute trip to the chapel for prayer. So you're not committed to a monastic life, so your rule probably wouldn't fit with the Benedictine ordering of the rule. But if you spend a week in a monastery, you could feel that rhythm and maybe translate that into part of your life. But here are some examples. Here I got first one, prayer and worship. A good example of a personal rule would be something like, and these are, of course, something you'd write in the first person. I will begin each day with morning prayer. Right? So you could open up your prayer book and start with opening sentences of scripture. And the prayer book makes it easy to do this because what you're going to read is already on the schedule. But it could be like, I'll begin each day with my section from the Bible in a year, or I'll begin each day with my Psalms with Spurgeon, or I'll begin each day with whatever it is that you're doing. But an example of a personal rule is, how will I incorporate prayer into today? And then your rule for weekly. It says, attend church weekly and participate in sacraments regularly. So now, as a Christian, that's kind of an obligation already, isn't it? I'm going to attend weekly in this. But in the monastic order, they might have weekly plus saints' days, plus holy days, plus days of obligation, all the red, white letter days, right? So this is just something you commit to. I think most modern Christians get this backwards, where they decide they're going to church every Saturday night. Right? Every Saturday night they decide, well, it's been a busy week. We went to church last week. Should we go? And they make this decision over and over and over and over again, or they get up in the morning, the kids throwing out, and they say, well, it's really important to go. A rule is not about making this decision a week. The rule is saying, this is who I am. I make this decision once, and it's going to apply for the next 52 weeks of this year and the next 100 years of my life. That's what the rule is. It's an intention for this is the kind of person I am. And the goal is that I know that the kind of person I will become is improved by obedience to this rule. I think all of us in this room agree, weekly attendance to communion, unless providentially hindered, is good for us. So that should be a part of your rule. And we recognize if you miss church, Mrs. Joel does something bad to you. No, no, something bad happens to you, says Mrs. Joel. No.
That's God, not you.
But so you can see, if you were writing out, okay, what kind of person do I want to become? And then working back to the tactics of how do I become that kind of person? Well, attending church weekly is certainly an important aspect. If you took that block out of your rule, you'd be losing something. Then the third point here is, I set aside evening reflection to examine my day and offer gratitude. So my favorite example of this is Mr. Jonathan Edwards, who kept a Puritan scholar, kept the daily log, and sometimes it's maligned as, am I in heaven or not in heaven? I don't think Edwards' opinion was, but Edwards wrote intentions, his resolutions, very famous resolutions. If you haven't read them, worth reading every year. Like, I resolve to be a Christian, and if nobody is, I resolve to do the same. So those are great resolutions, very similar to the personal rule. But then he would also write his gratitude at the end of the day, what he got accomplished. So if you're writing a personal rule about spiritual health, you can have things we do, habits we form, and actions that comport with that. I know many of us can go to bed without gratitude, but if it's in your rule, every night before I go to bed, I write 3 or 4 notes. This is what I'm grateful for today. It kind of changes, especially if you can go back 52 weeks before and on low days, note your gratitude. So next section of the personal rule. So prayer and worship, I think most churches are pretty good at least saying you're supposed to do these things. But connecting your rule to your work and vocation might be a little more difficult. Number 1, I wrote, I approach work as a calling from God, seeking to serve with diligence and integrity. I maintain set working hours to ensure a balance between labor and rest. I avoid distractions and cultivate excellence in all tasks. So, this is easier written down than obeying, but if you're the kind of guy who says, no matter what, at 6 o'clock I'm having dinner with my family for the rest of my child's lives, right? Then that's part of your rule, and you can see how you live with your children, but you have to kind of set that intention. Or I'm struggling with laziness, so I resolve that I begin work every morning at 8 a.m. even if I'm sleeping, something like that. Then our favorite section here, number 3, health and discipline. Number 3, health and discipline. I follow a consistent sleep schedule, early to bed, early to rise, because we all know that it'll be spiritually harmful for you if you don't, because you'll be mean to other people. There'll be a greater proclivity to sin if you're tired, impatient, unkind. I engage in daily physical exercise. That's maybe that's part of your rule. Or I maintain a healthy diet, eating moderation, fasting. So these can be part of your rule. The monks obeyed this as well, right? So no one was allowed to be a gluttonous monk. They had to obey health and discipline here. And their labor in the fields probably kept them in moderation as well. And then quickly running through these other ones, you can read these and help develop your own rule. But family and relationships, I resolve, or my rule includes, to prioritize family time with my spouse. And as you read through these examples, you see, okay, yeah, these are things I'll agree with. But have you ever put them all together and say, this is the Schumacher rule of life, or this is the Messias rule of life. This is what our family aims to do. And just like a monastic community, if mom wants to do something one way and dad wants to do something some way, then there is no order in the communal home. But if you have a common rule, then you're able to both work towards that common goal. If someone is really a fan of sleeping in, the other one's trying waking up early, that's going to be disorder. But if the rule says you're early to rise, early to rise, early to bed, early to bed, early to rise, then that helps with that. Now, the other parts here, learning and growth. You can create a rule about Each month I'm working through a book. If you want to follow the Rushduni model, each day I'm working through a new book, right? That's the Rushduni method, a book a day. Right, I think the mail will come, you get the book, you read the book, next day the mail will come, you read the book. So that's pretty aesthetic, I think. And then you can imagine there's lots of different things you can put in your rule, but my challenge to you as we're approaching the season of Lent is a good time to develop a personal rule. And during the 40 days of Lent, you can be a little more rigorous in establishing some habits, see what were easy to keep, what were hard to keep, and that will reveal also some more of yourself. Like if you say, I'm gonna walk for 10 minutes every day, you only did it 10 times out of 40 times, well then maybe you're really struggling with sloth or keeping your own promises to yourself, etc. And your rule should create an easier habit to run the rest of the year. So, any thoughts, questions on that? Is that helpful? Is that weird? The practical part of it is this empire will fall. Where are the Benedicts today? Right? If we are just as disordered as the world, who's going to rebuild in the ruins? But if we have a solution, a rule that we can give to the people in the absence of public school, government programs, whatever else collapses around us, then just like Benedict was successful in imposing his rule, St. Paul's, Canterbury, we're going to be the new rule that preserves the leaven in the midst of Lent. Make sense? So I'm going to grab the bullets and so we can do some music after this.